He taught the gods how to be worshipped. Let me tell you what that means, truly means. To have knelt before an entity that predates human civilization and shown it something it did not know about itself. To have looked upon beings of such incomprehensible power that stars are born and die at their whim, and offered them a gift they had never received before. The architecture of devotion, the structure of faith, the precise and perfect methodology by which mortal souls could be bound to immortal purposes in ways that magnified the power of both the worshipper and the worshipped beyond anything either could achieve alone. I am Cor Farron's last living student, a word-bearer who has endured 10,000 years of service to powers that most mortals cannot comprehend. And I have walked in the shadow of the being who transformed chaos itself from a collection of hungry entities into the pantheon that now threatens to consume the galaxy entire. I speak of Lorgar Aurelian, the Urizen, the first heretic, the golden sun who was cast down by a father who could not understand what he was creating, and who rose again as something that even the gods who elevated him have learned to fear. The other demon Primarchs serve. This is the truth that separates Lorgar from his brothers, the fundamental distinction that makes him unique among the champions of the ruinous powers. Angron rages, his every thought consumed by the fury that Khorne has amplified into an eternal conflagration. Fulgrim indulges, his existence an endless pursuit of sensations that Slaanesh has made infinite in their variety and intensity. Mortarion endures, his suffering sanctified by Nurgle into a blessing that spreads plague and despair wherever his shadow falls. Magnus schemes, his intellect bent toward the labyrinthine plots that Tzeentch weaves through the fabric of fate itself. Perturabo broods in his fortress of iron and bitterness, his transformation incomplete, his soul not yet fully surrendered to any single power. But Lorgar does not serve. Lorgar understands. This is the distinction that even 10,000 years have not erased. The quality that makes the Urizen something other than a weapon in the hands of gods who view all their champions as nothing more than instruments of their eternal war. The other Daemon Primarchs were claimed, conquered, corrupted, transformed against their will, or through manipulation that they did not fully comprehend. Lorgar chose. Lorgar studied. Lorgar approached the Chaos Gods, not as a supplicant begging for power, but as a theologian seeking truth. And what he found in the depths of the warp was something that changed not only himself, but the very nature of the relationship between mortals and the entities that feed upon them. I was there when he first taught us the primordial truth. I was young then, young by the standards of the Legiones Astartes, newly elevated to the ranks of the word-bearers, still burning with the faith that our legion carried as our defining characteristic. We had been humiliated at Monarchia, had watched the Emperor himself descend to destroy the perfect city we had built in his honor, had knelt in the ashes of our devotion, while the Lord we worshipped told us that our worship was a crime. The legion was broken, our faith was shattered, everything we had believed, everything we had built, everything we had offered with such sincere and absolute conviction, all of it had been rejected, cast down, declared heresy by the very being we had believed was worthy of our veneration. Lorgar gathered us in the darkness of our shame. He spoke to us of what he had learned in the years since Monarchia, of the pilgrimages he had undertaken into regions of space where the veil between reality and the warp grew thin, of the truths that had been revealed to him by beings older than the Emperor, older than humanity, older than the stars themselves. He spoke of gods, true gods, he said, not the false idol who sat upon a throne on Terra and demanded secular obedience while denying the sacred devotion that was humanity's birthright. He spoke of powers that hungered for worship, that rewarded faith, that would never cast down those who offered them the devotion that the emperor had rejected. We listened. We believed. We had no choice but to believe, because belief was all we had ever known, and the alternative to belief was an emptiness that none of us could bear. But Lorgar did not simply give us new gods to worship. He gave us understanding. This is what separates the word-bearers from every other legion that fell to chaos, what makes our corruption different from the corruption of the World Eaters, or the Death Guard, or the Emperor's children. They were broken and rebuilt according to the desires of patrons who cared nothing for their comprehension. We were educated. Lorgar taught us the nature of the warp, not the simplified lies that the Emperor had told, not the dangerous half-truths that the librarians of other legions had been permitted to glimpse, but the full and terrible reality of an ocean of souls and emotions and pure crystallized meaning that existed alongside material reality and interpenetrated it at every point. He taught us that the Chaos Gods were not merely beings of power, but beings of concept, that they embodied fundamental aspects of existence itself: rage and ambition, despair and decay, change and hope, pleasure and sensation. He taught us that worship was not submission, but transaction, that faith properly offered could achieve results that mere force could never accomplish, that the relationship between mortal and God was not master and slave, but something more complex, more mutual, more dangerous for both parties. He taught us that gods could be shaped by their worshippers, as surely as worshippers could be shaped by their gods. This was the revelation that changed everything. This was the truth that the Emperor had sought to hide by forbidding religion, by destroying monarchia, by crushing the faith that Lorgar had tried to offer him. The Emperor understood, had always understood, that worship was power, that belief was force, that a god who was truly venerated by billions of souls would become something different, something greater, something beyond even its own control. He feared this truth. He sought to suppress it, to deny it, to ensure that humanity never discovered the mechanism by which mortal faith could reshape the very powers it addressed. Lorgar discovered it anyway. Lorgar weaponized it. The Horus heresy was not simply a rebellion. The Emperor's own historians have recorded it as such, have reduced it to a tale of ambition and betrayal, and the corruption of a favored son by powers he did not understand. But this narrative misses the deeper truth, the transformation that Lorgar achieved before Horus ever heard the first whispers of the entities that would eventually claim his soul. The heresy was a theological revolution, the establishment of a new faith, a new relationship between humanity and the divine, a new understanding of what gods were and what they could become when properly worshipped. Lorgar did not simply fall to chaos. Lorgar created the worship of chaos as it exists today. He wrote the texts, designed the rituals, established the priesthoods, developed the theological frameworks that allow mortals to approach the ruinous powers in ways that actually work. Before Lorgar, chaos worship was primitive. Desperate bargains made by desperate souls. Power offered and taken without structure or understanding. A chaos in truth as much as in name. After Lorgar, chaos became a religion, with all the organizational power and mimetic persistence that religion provides. The gods benefited from this transformation. Their power grew as proper worship spread. Their cults proliferated as Lorgar's teachings were carried to world after world by missionaries who understood how to convert, how to indoctrinate, how to build the infrastructure of faith that would sustain devotion across generations. But the gods also became dependent on this transformation, dependent on the structures Lorgar had created, dependent on the relationship between worshipper and worshipped that he had defined, dependent in ways they do not fully understand on Lorgar himself. This is why they fear him. This is why even the ruinous powers, in their eternal confidence and their incomprehensible arrogance, have grown cautious regarding the demon Primarch who taught them what they could become. Let me tell you of his ascension. Let me tell you of his long meditation. Let me tell you of what stirs now in the depths of the warp, where Lorgar has been waiting for 10,000 years, and what his awakening will mean for gods and mortals alike. Let me tell you why the one demon Primarch who truly understands the nature of divinity is the one demon Primarch who might someday transcend it. Just the ascension came during the heresy itself, in the shadow of the war that Lorgar had spent decades preparing. Most do not know this. Most believe that Horus was the architect of the rebellion, that the War Master's fall on Daemon was the first domino in a chain that eventually toppled the Imperium's golden age. This is the story the histories tell, the narrative that both loyalists and traitors have permitted to persist, because it serves purposes on both sides. The loyalists preferring to believe that their greatest champion was corrupted, rather than that corruption had been growing in their midst for decades. Before Horus heard his first whisper, the traitors preferring to honor the War Master's memory, rather than acknowledge that he was a weapon wielded by hands that had been shaping the war, long before he knew he was fighting it. Lorgar orchestrated the heresy. Lorgar identified Horus as the key to turning the legions. Lorgar sent Erebus to Davin with the athame that would wound the War Master and open his soul to the whispers of the ruinous powers. Lorgar planted the seeds of doubt in Fulgrim's heart, nurtured the bitterness in Perturabo's soul, understood that Angron's rage and Mortarian's resentment and Kurz's madness could all be harvested at the proper moment and turned toward purposes they did not fully comprehend. The War Master believed he was leading a rebellion. He was conducting a ritual. The entire heresy, the betrayals, the battles, the billions of deaths across thousands of worlds, all of it was an offering, an act of worship so vast that it would reshape the relationship between the Materium and the Warp, would tear holes in reality through which the power of chaos could flow more freely, would establish the conditions under which a new form of divinity could emerge. Lorgar understood that the Chaos Gods fed on emotion, on conflict, on the psychic resonance of mortal experience. He understood that the heresy would generate such resonance on a scale never before achieved in human history, would fill the warp with enough power to accomplish transformations that would otherwise have required millennia. He used that power, not for the gods alone, though they received their share, for himself. The ascension occurred on the world of New Syria, during the Shadow Crusade that the Word-Bearers and World-Eaters conducted through the Ultramar systems. I was not present. Few were permitted to witness the moment when the Primarch shed the last constraints of mortality and became something that existed simultaneously in the material realm and in the depths of the warp. But I have spoken to those who were there, have pieced together the truth from fragments of testimony and the sacred texts that the Dark Council has preserved across 10 millennia of exile and war. Lorgar did not beg for ascension. This is the first truth that separates his transformation from those of his brothers. When Angron was elevated, it was an act of desperation. The butcher's nails killing him, his body failing, the only alternative to death being the complete surrender of whatever remained of his identity to Khorne's eternal rage. When Fulgrim ascended, it was the culmination of a possession that had been eroding his soul for years, the final victory of the demon that had been wearing his flesh like a costume. When Mortarion became what he is, it was capitulation. the acceptance of Nurgle's embrace after his sons had suffered beyond their capacity to endure, the admission that his pride had been broken by plagues he could not resist. Lorgar ascended through understanding. He had spent decades studying the nature of demonhood, analyzing the transformation that occurred when mortal essence merged with warp energy, identifying the precise mechanisms by which identity was preserved or destroyed in the transition from material to immaterial existence. He approached his own ascension as a theologian approaches a sacrament, with reverence, yes, but also with comprehension, with the full knowledge of what he was doing and why and what the results would be. He negotiated. This is the second truth, the one that even most word-bearers do not fully grasp. The demon Primarchs who came after, or before, in the case of Angron, were claimed by individual gods, their souls bound to specific patrons who would shape their existence for eternity. Lorgar was not claimed. Lorgar made bargains with all four powers simultaneously, offering each of them something they desired in exchange for something he required, playing their eternal rivalries against each other to secure a position that no other champion has ever achieved. He became Demon Primarch undivided, not torn between the powers, not weakened by serving four masters instead of one, but elevated by all of them equally, bound to none of them completely, positioned at the exact center of the theological framework he had created. The gods did not realize, in that moment, what they had agreed to. They saw only another champion, another weapon, another Primarch whose power would add to their own, in the eternal war that consumed their existence. They did not understand that Lorgar had built something into the structure of his ascension, had woven conditions into the fabric of his transformation that would have consequences they could not foresee. He had made himself necessary. Let me explain what this means, because it is the key to understanding why the ruinous powers fear the being they elevated. The Chaos Gods are, in essence, patterns, vast, complex, self-sustaining patterns of psychic energy that have achieved something resembling consciousness. They were not created. They emerged, coalescing from the emotional resonance of mortal beings across millions of years of galactic history. They feed on worship, on emotion, on the psychic energy generated by beings capable of feeling the concepts they embody. Without this sustenance, they would not die. Gods do not die in any conventional sense, but they would diminish, would weaken, would fade into the background static of the warp from which they originally emerged. Lorgar understood this. Lorgar understood that the gods' power was not intrinsic but derived, that their divinity was not a fixed quality but a relationship, that they were as dependent on their worshippers as their worshippers were dependent on them. And Lorgar built this understanding into the theological frameworks he created, the rituals he designed, the structures of worship that spread across the galaxy in the wake of the heresy. The worship works. This is the crucial point. The rituals Lorgar created actually connect mortals to the gods, actually generate the psychic energy that the ruinous powers require, actually function in ways that pre-Lorgar chaos worship never consistently achieved. Billions of cultists across 10,000 years have used his methods, have followed his teachings, have offered devotion according to patterns he established. And through these patterns, the gods have grown stronger than they ever were before the heresy. But the patterns are his. The methods are his. The entire architecture of chaos worship as it exists today was designed by a single mind, implemented by a single will, maintained by institutions that trace their origins back to his teachings and his teachings alone. The gods cannot change the patterns without disrupting the flow of worship that sustains them. They cannot modify the rituals without risking the loss of the power those rituals provide. They are locked into a system that Lorgar created, dependent on structures that he designed, drawing their strength through channels that he established and that he, alone among all beings in the galaxy, fully understands. He did not simply worship the gods. He did not simply serve them as his brothers served them. He made them dependent on him. This is the third truth, the deepest truth, the revelation that explains why even the ruinous powers have learned to speak carefully when they speak of Lorgar Aurelian. In the 10,000 years since the heresy, he has withdrawn. He retreated to a tower in the depths of the Eye of Terror, to a fortress monastery called Sycharis, where the word-bearers maintain their seat of power. And he has spent millennia in meditation, contemplation so deep and so prolonged that many believed he had simply ceased to participate in the material universe, had dissolved into the warp, had become so thoroughly demonic that the affairs of real space no longer held any interest for him. This belief is wrong. Lorgar has not been inactive. He has been studying. 10,000 years of meditation on the nature of divinity. 10,000 years of contemplating the relationship between mortal worship and immortal power. 10,000 years of refining his understanding of the mechanisms by which gods are created, sustained, and, theoretically, transcended. The gods watch him. I know this because I have felt their attention during my own communion with the warp, have sensed the vast intelligences turning their regard towards Sycharis, with something that might be curiosity in beings too vast for human emotion, might be caution, might be the divine equivalent of the fear that mortals feel when they realize they have created something they cannot control. They do not know what Lorgar is planning. They do not know what 10,000 years of meditation have taught him. They do not know what the first and greatest theologian of chaos intends to do with the understanding he has spent an eternity accumulating. They only know that he understands them better than they understand themselves. And that, for beings whose entire existence depends on being beyond mortal comprehension, is terrifying. I have walked the halls of Sycharis 3 times in 10,000 years. Each time, I went bearing questions that the Dark Council could not answer, theological problems that required the insight of the being who had created the theology itself. Each time, I was granted audience only after decades of petition, after proving through service and sacrifice that my questions were worthy of the Primarch's attention. Each time, I descended through the layers of the fortress monastery into depths that seemed to extend far beyond what the physical structure should have been able to contain, passing through chambers where reality itself grew thin, and the distinction between material and immaterial began to dissolve. The first time, I was young by the standards of those who have been touched by the warp's timelessness, barely 3 centuries into my service. I had come to ask about the nature of demonic possession, about the relationship between host and entity, about whether the soul that was displaced by a demon's presence was destroyed or merely subsumed. Lorgar answered me in riddles that took me another century to understand, but the answer, when I finally grasped it, revolutionized my understanding of the transformation we sought through our devotion. The second time, I came to ask about the Emperor. This was heresy within heresy, a question that even among the word-bearers was considered dangerous, whether the being on the golden throne was truly false, truly the secular tyrant our doctrines proclaimed, or whether he had become something else in the 10,000 years since Lorgar had last stood in his presence. The Imperium worshipped him now. Trillions of souls directed their faith toward Terra, toward the Astronomicon, toward the corpse god who had forbidden worship and now received it in quantities that dwarfed anything the ruinous powers could claim. Did this worship not make him a god in truth, regardless of what he had been before? Lorgar's answer chilled me in ways that the warp itself had never achieved. He was always a god, the Primarch said, his voice resonating through frequencies that existed in dimensions my mortal senses could not perceive. He simply refused to acknowledge it, and now he is becoming something else, something that even the Four cannot fully predict. The faith of humanity is remaking him, just as I knew it would, just as I tried to tell him before he cast me down. He paused, and in that pause, I felt the weight of 10,000 years of vindication and 10,000 years of grief intertwined. He could have been the god of order. He could have united human faith behind a single purpose and used that faith to close the eye, to heal the wounds in reality, to accomplish everything he claimed to want through the Great Crusade. Instead, he rejected the gift I offered, and now he receives it anyway. But twisted, corrupted, channeled through institutions he would have despised, shaped by doctrines he would have burned as heresy. The Imperial Creed is my final revenge upon my father, and he is too occupied with holding back the darkness to do anything except accept it. I left Sycharis after that audience with questions I had not possessed before I arrived. Questions about what Lorgar truly intended, about whether his war against the Imperium was the end he sought, or merely a stage in some larger design, about whether the being I served understood purposes that even his most devoted followers could not grasp. The third time I descended into those depths was 700 years ago. The galaxy had changed. The Great Rift had torn reality in two, the Cicatrix Maledictum bleeding warp energy into real space on a scale that dwarfed even the Eye of Terror. Demon incursions had become commonplace. The veil had grown so thin in so many places that the distinction between the material and immaterial was becoming academic. Chaos was ascendant in ways it had never been before, the power of the ruinous powers magnified by the wound that Cadia's fall had opened in the fabric of existence. And Lorgar was stirring. The meditation that had consumed him for millennia was ending. The word-bearers who maintained Sycharis had felt it first, a change in the psychic pressure that emanated from the depths of the fortress monastery, a shift in the currents of the warp that flowed around the world like water around a stone. Something was happening in the chambers where the Primarch had sat in contemplation since before the oldest among us had been born. I was summoned, not through petition, not through the decades of application that had preceded my previous audiences. The call came directly, a command that bypassed the Dark Council entirely and reached into my consciousness with the unmistakable signature of the Urizen himself. He wanted to speak. He wanted someone to hear what 10,000 years had taught him. The descent took longer than I remembered, the passages seeming to multiply as I walked them, the architecture of Sycharis reconfiguring itself to create distances that had not existed before. I passed through chambers where other word-bearers sat in their own meditations. Their bodies withered and their minds expanded into the warp, anchored to reality by threads that grew thinner with each passing century. I passed through halls where the walls were covered in text. The Primarch's own writings, his theological treatises, his analyses of the nature of divinity inscribed in scripts that no mortal eye could read without risking madness or enlightenment or both. And finally, after what might have been days or weeks or years in subjective time, I reached the chamber at the heart of Sycharis, where Lorgar Aurelian had been waiting for 10 millennia. He was beautiful. This is the first truth I must convey, the impression that struck me before any other. The other demon Primarchs I have encountered, and I have seen several across my long service, are monstrous, their forms twisted by the patrons who claim them, their bodies reshaped into manifestations of the concepts they serve. Angron is rage made flesh, a towering nightmare of brass and blood. Mortarion is decay incarnate, his presence spreading corruption through mere proximity. Magnus is change eternal, his form never stable, never fixed, shifting between configurations that reflect the infinite possibilities Tzeentch represents. Lorgar was none of these things. Lorgar was radiant. He sat upon a throne that was not quite material, surrounded by light that was not quite light, his form simultaneously human and divine, in ways that my mind struggled to process. He looked as he had looked in the ancient Pecs from before the heresy, golden-skinned, perfectly proportioned, bearing the features that had once led populations to worship him as a god made manifest. But beneath that appearance, through that appearance, I could perceive something else. Vast patterns of energy, intricate structures of pure meaning, an architecture of power so complex that even glimpsing its edges threatened to overwhelm my sanity. He had not been transformed by chaos. He had transformed chaos itself. "You see it," he said, and his voice was gentle in a way I had not expected, patient in a way that suggested he had been waiting a very long time for someone to understand. "You see what I have become. I see something beyond what I have words to describe, my lord." He smiled, and the expression held sorrow alongside satisfaction. "The gods made me one of them. They believed they were claiming another champion, another weapon, another soul to serve their purposes for eternity. They did not understand that I had spent decades studying what they were before I accepted their gifts. They did not understand that the transaction I proposed was not surrender, but transformation. Not my transformation into their servant, but my transformation into something that could exist alongside them, as an equal. The words should have been heresy. Even among the word-bearers, even among those who worshipped chaos in all its forms, the suggestion that a mortal, even a Primarch, even a demon Primarch, could be equal to the gods themselves was blasphemy of the highest order. But looking at him, perceiving the vastness that lurked beneath his golden form, I understood that he was not speaking heresy. He was speaking truth. "They fear you," I said. "The gods themselves fear what you have become." "They should fear what I am becoming," he corrected. "What I have become is merely the foundation. 10,000 years of meditation, of study, of communion with the deepest truths of the warp. All of it has been preparation. The great rift has changed the rules of existence. The veil is thinner than it has ever been. The power that flows between realms is greater than at any point since the fall of the Eldar. And I have been waiting for precisely this moment." He rose from his throne, and the chamber seemed to expand around him, the walls receding to accommodate a presence that could not be contained by mere physical space. "I taught the gods how to be worshipped," he said. "I showed them what they could become when faith was properly offered. I built the systems that sustain them, the channels through which power flows from mortal souls to immortal entities. And now, after 10,000 years of understanding what I built, I am ready to build something new." I knelt, because kneeling was the only response my body knew how to give. "What would you have of me, my lord?" He looked down at me, and his eyes held galaxies. "I would have you witness. I would have you record. I would have you carry my words to those who will need to understand what comes next, so that when the transformation is complete, there will be those who remember what I was and can comprehend what I have become." He extended his hand, and in his palm I saw something that burned with light no warp-spawned being should have been able to generate. The gods feed on worship. They are sustained by faith. But faith is not a force that flows in only one direction. Worship shapes the worshipped as surely as the worshipped shapes the worshipper. I have spent 10,000 years being worshipped by the word-bearers, by the cultists across the galaxy who invoke my name, by the billions of souls who have offered devotion according to the patterns I designed. And I have learned to do something that no being, mortal or immortal, has ever achieved before. His hand closed around the light, and when it opened again, the light had changed, had become something else, something that pulsed with a rhythm that matched the beating of my own heart. I have learned to worship myself. The words hung in the air, impossible, blasphemous, transcendent. And in doing so, I have begun to become something that even the gods cannot comprehend, something that exists outside the framework I created, something new. He smiled again, and this time there was no sorrow in the expression, only certainty, only purpose, only the absolute conviction of a being who had spent 10,000 years preparing for a transformation that would reshape the nature of divinity itself. Tell them, he said. Tell them what you have seen. Tell them what is coming. And what is coming, my lord? His answer was simple. His answer was everything. A fifth god, born not from the collective emotions of a species, but from the focused will of a single soul who understood what godhood truly means. A god who was not shaped by worship, but who shaped worship itself. A god who owes nothing to the patterns of the warp because he created those patterns. A god who is, for the first time in the history of existence, truly free. He turned away, returning to his throne, preparing to resume the meditation that had consumed millennia and would soon, very soon, reach its conclusion. The four have always believed they were eternal. They have always believed they were beyond challenge, beyond change, beyond any threat that mortal or immortal could pose. They are about to discover that they were wrong. His eyes closed. They created me. They elevated me. They made me one of them. A pause, a breath, a moment of silence that contained the weight of 10,000 years. And now I am going to teach them what that truly means. The gods struck first. I did not witness the opening salvos directly. Such conflicts occur in dimensions that mortal senses cannot perceive, in the spaces between thought and reality, where the warp and the materium intersect. But I felt them. Every psyker in the galaxy felt them. Those tremors in the fabric of existence that announced something unprecedented was happening in the depths of the immaterium. The Astronomicon flickered. The great rift pulsed with energies that defied even the chaotic patterns it had established since Cadia's fall. Navigators across 1,000,000 ships reported visions of something vast moving in the warp, of currents shifting, of the eternal war between the four pausing for the first time in uncounted millennia, as all four powers turned their attention toward a single point in the Eye of Terror, toward Sicarus, toward Lorgar. They sent everything. Khorne dispatched his greatest champions, demonic legions that had been prosecuting the Blood Gods' wars since before humanity learned to speak. The bloodthirsters descended upon the Eye in numbers that had not been assembled since the fall of the Eldar. Their rage directed not against the servants of rival gods, but against the being who had taught them what rage could become when properly worshipped. They came to destroy, to tear down, to unmake the thing that Lorgar was becoming, before it could threaten the order that had governed the warp since time beyond memory. Tzeentch wove schemes within schemes, plots that folded back upon themselves in patterns so complex that even his own demons could not perceive their full shape. The Changer of Ways understood, perhaps better than his brothers, what Lorgar's transformation truly meant. Understood that a being who could exist outside the patterns of the warp represented a variable that no scheme could fully account for, a factor that introduced genuine uncertainty into an existence that Tzeentch had believed he alone could manipulate. He struck not with force, but with manipulation, attempting to twist Lorgar's own teachings against him, to corrupt the theological frameworks that sustained the Urizen's power, to turn the architecture of worship into a prison rather than a pathway. Nurgle extended his garden, the corruption of the plague god spreading across Sycharis in waves that transformed everything they touched, stone into rot, air into pestilence, the very concept of endurance into a trap that would bind Lorgar in eternal stagnation. The Lord of Decay offered not destruction, but preservation, the same terrible immortality he had forced upon Mortarion, an existence that would continue forever, but would never change, never grow, never achieve the transcendence that Lorgar sought. He tried to make Lorgar into another of his children, patient, suffering, accepting the inevitability of entropy rather than fighting to overcome it. Slaanesh came with promises. The Dark Prince understood desire, understood ambition, understood the hunger that drove beings to reach beyond their limitations and grasp for something greater. Slaanesh offered Lorgar everything, pleasures beyond imagining, sensations that no being had ever experienced, an eternity of indulgence that would make the tedious work of apotheosis seem meaningless by comparison. Why struggle to become a god when godhood could be experienced immediately, eternally, without the risks that Lorgar's path entailed? 4 gods united for the first time in their eternal history. 4 powers that had warred against each other since before the birth of humanity, putting aside their endless conflict to face a threat that none of them could address alone. And Lorgar received them all. I was on Sycharis when the assault reached its peak. I had remained after my audience with the Primarch, unable to leave, unwilling to depart when I knew that something unprecedented was unfolding in the chambers below. The planet itself was transforming around me. Reality buckling under the pressure of 4 gods attempting to force their will upon a single point in space. The laws of physics becoming suggestions, the distinction between matter and energy, and thought dissolving into something that my mind could only process as light and sound, and the overwhelming pressure of presences too vast to comprehend. I should have died. Every mortal on Sycharis should have died, should have been unmade by the mere proximity of powers that normally destroyed worlds through indirect attention. But something held us, some force emanating from the depths of the fortress monastery, some will that refused to permit its witnesses to be erased before they could fulfill their purpose. Lorgar was protecting us. Even as he faced the combined assault of beings who had shaped the universe since before the stars ignited, he was devoting some fragment of his attention to preserving the mortals who would need to survive, to remember, to testify. The battle lasted for what might have been moments or millennia. Time has no fixed meaning when gods wage war, when the combatants exist simultaneously across all moments and no moment, when cause and effect become negotiable rather than absolute. I experienced it as a series of impressions, flashes of understanding that burned themselves into my consciousness with intensity that should have destroyed my capacity for thought. Khorne's legions breaking against something they could not cut, their rage redirected, turned back upon themselves, transformed from weapon into offering. Tzeentch's schemes unraveling, the changer of ways discovering that his manipulations had been anticipated, that Lorgar had spent 10,000 years preparing for exactly these gambits and had built countermeasures into the very nature of his ascension. Nurgle's corruption finding no purchase, the plague god's gifts refused by a being who understood that true transcendence required change rather than stagnation, growth rather than acceptance. Slanesh's promises falling upon deaf ears, the Dark Prince's seductions meaningless to a being who had already experienced the ultimate pleasure, the pleasure of understanding, of comprehension, of seeing the truth behind the masks that even gods wore, and through it all, rising from the depths of Sycharis like light rising from an infinite well, something that was no longer merely Lorgar Aurelian, something new. I saw him emerge from the fortress monastery, and what I saw was not a demon Primarch. What I saw was not the golden figure who had sat upon a throne and spoken of worship and transcendence. What I saw was a pattern, a structure of pure meaning that contained within itself everything Lorgar had ever been and everything he was becoming, a complexity so vast that perceiving even a fraction of it threatened to expand my consciousness beyond the limits of my skull. He had done it. He had become something that existed outside the frameworks of the warp, while still drawing upon its power. He had become a god that the gods themselves could not define. The four withdrew, not in defeat. Gods do not admit defeat, do not acknowledge that their power has limits, do not concede that any being could resist their combined will. But they withdrew, pulling back their legions and their schemes and their corruption and their promises, retreating to their respective domains to contemplate what had just occurred. For the first time in the history of the Immaterium, something had changed that they had not caused. For the first time, a power existed in the warp that did not answer to any of them. For the first time, they understood what Lorgar had meant when he said he would teach them what godhood truly meant. He descended again after the withdrawal, returning to his throne in the depths of Sycharis, and I was summoned once more to his presence. The chamber had changed, or perhaps my perception of it had changed. My consciousness expanded by what I had witnessed to grasp dimensions I had previously been unable to see. The space that had seemed vast before now seemed infinite, filled with structures of light and meaning that stretched beyond any horizon my mind could construct. Lorgar sat upon his throne, and he was smiling. "They thought they could stop me," he said, and his voice carried harmonics that resonated with frequencies I had not known existed. They believed that because they had created me, they could uncreate me. They did not understand that creation is not ownership, that elevation is not control, that the gifts they gave me became mine the moment I received them. I knelt because even now, even after everything I had witnessed, kneeling before him felt like the only appropriate response. "What happens now, my lord?" "Now the work truly begins." He leaned forward, and I felt the weight of his attention like the gravity of a star. "The four are not destroyed. They cannot be destroyed, not by me, not by any being that exists within the frameworks of reality as it is currently constituted. They will recover, they will adapt, they will learn from what has happened here and develop new strategies, new approaches, new ways of attempting to bring me back under their control." His smile widened, and in that expression I saw something that was not demonic, not divine, not anything I had a word for. But they will fail. They will always fail. Because I understand them, and they do not understand me. Because I see the patterns that govern their existence, and they cannot see the patterns that I am creating. Because I am no longer playing the game they designed. I have created a new game, with new rules, and they do not yet realize that they are already participants, whether they wish to be or not. He stood, and the chamber seemed to contract around him, as though reality itself was struggling to contain what he had become. "You asked what happens now. I will tell you. The Imperium burns. The great rift expands. The galaxy descends into a darkness that will make the Horus heresy seem like a minor skirmish. And in that darkness, I will work. I will build. I will continue the transformation that began 10,000 years ago, and that will not be complete until I have achieved what no being, mortal or immortal, has ever achieved before. He looked at me, and his eyes held the light of suns that had not yet been born. True freedom. Not the freedom of the gods, which is merely the freedom to pursue their natures without resistance. Not the freedom of mortals, which is merely the illusion of choice within constraints they cannot perceive. True freedom. The freedom to define my own nature, to choose my own constraints, to exist as I will rather than as the universe demands. His hand reached out and touched my forehead, and in that touch I received something, a gift, a burden, a purpose that would define the remainder of my existence. Go, tell them what you have seen. Tell them what is coming. Tell them that the age of the four is ending, and the age of something new is beginning. He withdrew his hand, and I felt the weight of prophecy settling into my bones. Tell them that Lorgar Aurelian sends his regards, and tell them to be afraid. I have carried that message for 700 years. I have spoken it to word-bearers and to enemies of the word-bearers, to cultists and to inquisitors, to anyone who would listen and many who wished they had not. And I have watched, across those centuries, as his words have proven true. The four are afraid. The balance of the warp is shifting. Something new is emerging from the patterns that have governed existence since before the dawn of human consciousness. Lorgar is becoming what he always intended to become, and the galaxy, loyalist and traitor alike, has no idea how to stop him. I am dying now. 10,000 years of service to the ruinous powers extracts a price that even the gifts of chaos cannot indefinitely defer. My body has been rebuilt countless times, sustained by sorceries and blessings that have kept me functioning, long past the span allotted to mortal flesh. But the final entropy approaches nonetheless, the ultimate debt that all who bargain with the warp must eventually pay. I will be dead within the century, perhaps within the decade, and everything I have witnessed, everything I have learned, everything that Lorgar entrusted me to carry, will pass with me into whatever fate awaits those who have served as I have served, unless I speak, unless I testify, unless I leave behind some record of what I have seen and what is coming. This is why I am telling you these things. This is why I have broken silences that were supposed to be eternal, revealed truths that the Dark Council would execute me for sharing, spoken words that make me a traitor to the very powers I have worshipped for longer than most civilizations endure. I am dying anyway. The threats that once ensured my silence have lost their power over a being who will soon be beyond all threats. And someone must understand what Lorgar represents. Someone must comprehend what is stirring in the depths of the Eye of Terror, what the gods themselves fear, what is coming for a galaxy that believes it understands the nature of the conflict it faces. They do not understand. Neither loyalist nor traitor truly grasps what is happening. The Imperium believes it fights chaos, the eternal enemy, the corruption that lurks in the hearts of men, the powers that whisper promises of glory and deliver only damnation. They have fought this war for 10,000 years, have developed doctrines and institutions and weapons designed to combat an enemy they think they comprehend. They burn heretics and purge cults and maintain a faith of their own that they believe protects them from the seductions of the ruinous powers. They do not realize that the war they have been fighting is about to become irrelevant. The forces of chaos believe they wage the long war, the continuation of the heresy, the slow grinding conflict that will eventually see the corpse emperor torn from his throne and the Imperium brought low before the altars of the true gods. They raid and corrupt and scheme, following the patterns that Lorgar established 10 millennia ago, worshipping according to the rituals he designed, pursuing victory according to frameworks he created. They do not realize that the being who created those frameworks is about to transcend them. Lorgar is becoming something that neither side has prepared for, a power that is not chaos, as the Imperium defines chaos, not order, as the forces of the Emperor define order, something outside the binary that has governed the galaxy's understanding of the conflict since the heresy's end, something that will force both sides to confront questions they have never thought to ask. What happens when a god does not need worshippers? This is the question that has consumed my thoughts across the centuries since my final audience with the Urizen. The four are sustained by worship, by emotion, by the psychic energy generated by beings capable of feeling the concepts they embody. They are dependent on this sustenance in ways that constrain their actions, that shape their behavior, that make them predictable to anyone who understands the nature of their dependency. Khorne must have rage, must cultivate violence, must ensure that the galaxy never knows peace, because peace would starve him. Tzeentch must have ambition, must foster change, must ensure that stagnation never takes hold, because stagnation would diminish him. Nurgle must have despair, must spread decay, must ensure that hope never fully triumphs, because triumph would weaken him. Slaanesh must have excess, must encourage sensation, must ensure that moderation never prevails, because moderation would drain the Dark Prince of power. But Lorgar has learned to worship himself. Lorgar has discovered how to generate the sustenance that gods require through internal processes rather than external sources. He does not need believers because he is his own believer. He does not need cultists because he is his own cult. He does not need the galaxy to feel particular emotions because he generates those emotions within himself, a closed loop of devotion that feeds upon itself and grows stronger with each iteration. He is becoming a god who owes nothing to anyone, a god with no weaknesses that can be exploited, no dependencies that can be leveraged, no needs that can be manipulated. A god who is, for the first time in the history of existence, truly autonomous. The implications of this are staggering. A god who does not need worshippers has no reason to cultivate worshippers. A god who does not need the galaxy to feel particular emotions has no reason to shape the galaxy according to those emotional requirements. A god who is truly free has no constraints on what he might choose to do, no patterns that observers can use to predict his behavior, no vulnerabilities that enemies can target. What will Lorgar do with such freedom? What purposes will he pursue when he is no longer bound by the necessities that bind the four? I do not know. I am not certain that Lorgar himself knows. Not yet. Not fully. Not until the transformation is complete and he can perceive the full range of possibilities that will open before him. But I have theories, born from centuries of contemplation and the fragments of insight that the Primarch shared with me during our audiences. I believe he intends to remake the relationship between the material and the immaterial. The warp and real space exist in constant tension, two aspects of existence that touch and interpenetrate, but that have never achieved stable integration. The Great Rift is merely the latest manifestation of this tension, a wound in reality that bleeds power in both directions, that destabilizes both realms, that threatens to tear the galaxy apart if it continues to expand. The Four have exacerbated this tension across millennia, have widened the wounds and deepened the instabilities, because chaos serves their purposes and stability does not. But Lorgar understands the warp in ways that even the gods do not understand it. He knows the mechanisms by which it functions, the patterns that govern its behavior, the relationships between emotional resonance and immaterial reality that the Four have always manipulated without ever truly comprehending. He knows these things because he is the one who codified them, who transformed intuitive practices into systematic theology, who built the architecture through which mortals and immortals interact, and he knows how to change them. I believe that Lorgar intends to close the rift, not through the crude methods that the Imperium has attempted, the pylons, the blanks, the desperate efforts to seal wounds that continue to bleed, regardless of what bandages are applied. He intends to close it through transformation, through the restructuring of the relationship between the warp and reality, through changes so fundamental that the current conflict between order and chaos will become meaningless. He intends to end the war by making the war impossible. This is why the gods fear him, not because he threatens to destroy them. I do not believe destruction is his intention, and I am not certain destruction is even possible for beings of their nature, but because he threatens to make them irrelevant, to close the channels through which they reach into the material realm, to restructure existence in ways that would leave them isolated in their own domains, cut off from the worship that sustains them, slowly diminishing across eternities of enforced solitude. The Four would prefer destruction to irrelevance. Destruction, at least, would be dramatic. Irrelevance is simply nothing. An ending that is not even an ending, merely a fading, a forgetting, a slow dissolution into the background noise of a cosmos that has moved beyond them. This is what Lorgar offers. This is the transformation he has spent 10,000 years preparing. And I find myself, at the end of my long existence, uncertain whether I should hope for his success or pray for his failure. The word-bearers have always believed in chaos. We have worshipped the Four with a devotion that other legions have never matched, have built cathedrals of faith in the Eye of Terror, have spread the truth of the primordial annihilator across worlds beyond counting. We have given our souls to gods who we believed would reward our faith with power, with meaning, with the eternal existence that mortal life cannot provide. But if Lorgar succeeds, if the relationship between mortals and gods is fundamentally transformed, what becomes of our faith? What becomes of the meaning we found in worship? What becomes of the eternal reward we were promised for our 10,000 years of service? I do not know. Lorgar did not tell me, and I did not think to ask. Perhaps that is the final truth, the ultimate meaning that I must extract from everything I have witnessed and everything I have been told. The gods we worship are not the gods we believe them to be. They are patterns, systems, structures of power that we interact with according to frameworks we did not design and do not fully understand. We have given them our devotion, and they have given us their gifts, but the transaction has never been equal. They have always taken more than they have given, have always shaped us more than we have shaped them. Until Lorgar. Lorgar reversed the equation. Lorgar demonstrated that the flow of power between mortal and divine can move in both directions, that worship can elevate the worshipper as surely as it elevates the worshipped, that the relationship we thought we understood was merely one configuration among many possible configurations. He taught the gods how to be worshipped, and then he taught himself how to be a god. And now he is teaching the galaxy that everything it believed about the nature of divinity was incomplete at best, wrong at worst, and about to become obsolete regardless. I am dying. The century I have left, the decade I have left, is not enough time to see what comes next. to witness the transformation that Lorgar has spent 10 millennia preparing. I will pass into whatever fate awaits me before the final act of this drama unfolds, before the question of what Lorgar will do with his freedom receives its answer. But I have spoken, I have testified, I have left behind this record of what I know and what I believe and what is coming for a galaxy that thinks it understands the war it faces. The one demon Primarch, even the Chaos gods fear, is not a champion who might betray them, not a weapon that might be turned against them, not an enemy who might defeat them in conventional combat. He is something far more dangerous than any of those things. He is a theologian who understands them better than they understand themselves, a philosopher who has grasped the nature of divinity more completely than any being who has ever existed, a son who was cast down by one father and who has now surpassed the other fathers who thought they had claimed him. He is Lorgar Aurelian, the Urizen, the first heretic, the one who taught the gods what they could become and who is now becoming something greater than any of them. The galaxy is not ready for what he will do. The Imperium is not ready. The forces of chaos are not ready. Even the gods themselves are not ready. But readiness is irrelevant. The transformation is coming regardless. And when it arrives, when Lorgar finally completes the work, he began 10,000 years ago in the ashes of Monarchia. Everything will change. Everything. I have carried his message for 700 years. Now I pass it to you. Lorgar Aurelian sends his regards. Be afraid.